The night had a way of swallowing things in Montana. It swallowed the mountains, first pulling them down behind a curtain of iron cloud. Then it took the grasslands, the fence posts, the skeletal pines bent sideways by decades of wind. By 10 o'clock on an evening in late October, there was nothing left of the world outside the old ranch house except cold and silence, and the low moan of air moving across empty pasture. Lena Hollister lay on the floor of the living room with her back pressed against the stone fireplace. She had not turned on a light in 6 days. She had learned to move through the house by memory, by the feel of floorboards under her bare feet, by counting steps from the kitchen doorway to the hall. She ate what she had carried in a canvas bag when she first climbed through the back window. Canned peaches, saltine crackers, 2 bottles of water that were now empty. She was 25 years old. Her chestnut brown hair fell loose around her shoulders, unwashed strands clinging to the skin of her neck. Her green eyes, sharp even in exhaustion, tracked every sound. The faded denim jacket she wore over a gray sweater smelled of wood smoke and fear. There was a scrape along her left ankle, partly healed from the night she had run. She was not waiting for rescue. She was waiting for the courage to do what needed to be done. Then she heard it, the low rumble of a truck engine coming up the gravel drive. Headlights swept across the curtains and disappeared. The engine died. A door opened and closed. Boots on gravel. Then a second sound, lighter, faster. An animal, 4 legs moving with purpose across the frozen ground. Lena pressed herself deeper into the corner. Her fingers found the handle of a rusted fireplace poker beside her. She gripped it and held her breath. A key turned in the front door lock. The hinges creaked open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of dry wood and old hay. Footsteps crossed the threshold. Steady, deliberate, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who knew how to enter dark rooms. Then came a low growl, not aggressive, warning, the sound of an animal detecting something that did not belong. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. She could see nothing in the darkness, only shapes, a tall figure near the doorway, a lower shape beside it, close to the ground, tense and alert. She did not move. She did not breathe. A small beam of light clicked on. A pen light, narrow and controlled, swept across the living room. It found the couch, the wooden table, the bookshelf missing half its shelves. Then it found her. The light stopped. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Now, before we go any further, you need to understand how these 2 strangers ended up in the same house on the same night in one of the most remote corners of Montana. Because what happened next was not coincidence. It was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. And to understand it, we need to go back. 6 weeks back to the day Lena Hollister's world cracked open. Dean Hollister had been a man built for land, 53 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands permanently rough from decades of fence wire and engine grease. His hair had gone silver at the temples, but remained thick, swept back from a face that had been carved by the sun and wind into something that looked almost geological. He had a habit of humming old country songs while he worked. He whistled when he was thinking. He laughed with his whole chest, the kind of laugh that made dogs wag their tails and strangers feel welcome. He had owned and operated Hollister Ranch for 22 years, 100 acres of rolling Montana pasture backed by foothills and timber. Cattle operation, modest but steady. Dean knew every fence post by name, every gully where water collected in spring, every patch of ground where the grass grew thin and needed rest. The land was not just his livelihood, it was his language. He spoke it fluently. Lena had grown up on that land. She was the only child of a marriage that ended when she was 9, her mother leaving for a quieter life in Billings. Lena stayed with her father, not because anyone asked her to choose, but because the ranch was the only place that ever felt like solid ground beneath her feet. Dean raised her the way he raised everything, with patience, with consistency, and with the quiet expectation that she would learn to stand on her own. By the time she was 12, she could mend a barbed wire fence without gloves. By 15, she could back a cattle trailer through a gate in the dark. By 20, she knew the ranch's financial margins by heart. The cost of feed per head, the seasonal price fluctuations of beef, the property tax schedule down to the cent. Dean never said he was proud of her in so many words. He did not need to. The way he handed her the books each quarter, the way he asked her opinion before signing contracts, the way he stood beside her at the fence line on summer evenings, watching the herd settle for the night. Those were his words. But Dean Hollister had one flaw that Lena recognized even as a teenager, long before it cost him everything. He trusted too easily, especially those he called friends. Victor Langley arrived in Dean's life 8 years before the explosion. He was in his mid-40s, clean-shaven with a sharp jawline and dark hair combed neatly to one side. He wore pressed shirts even on the ranch. His boots were always clean. He had the kind of handshake that communicated authority, the kind of smile that made you feel like you were being let in on something exclusive. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming not because they care about you, but because they have studied the mechanics of making people feel cared about. Victor had approached Dean with a business proposal. He had capital. Dean had land and livestock. A partnership would allow expansion, better equipment, access to larger buyers. Victor would handle the financial side, contracts, accounting, market relationships. Dean would continue doing what he did best, running the operation. It worked well for the first 5 years. Revenue increased. New fencing went up. A second barn was built. Dean began to relax about money for the first time in his adult life. He even talked about taking a vacation, something Lena had never heard him mention before. Then the numbers stopped adding up. It started small. A quarterly statement showing less revenue from a cattle shipment than Lena expected based on the head count. She mentioned it to her father over coffee one morning. Dean frowned, pulled out his own notebook, a battered leather journal where he tracked every animal, every delivery, every dollar, and compared the figures. They did not match. Over the following weeks, more discrepancies surfaced. Feed invoices that did not correspond to delivery logs. Equipment purchases listed at prices higher than market rate. A maintenance contract with a company Lena could not find registered in any state database. Dean was not an accountant, but he knew his ranch the way a captain knows his ship. He could feel when the weight was wrong, when something was pulling the vessel off course, even if he could not name the exact leak. He confronted Victor once casually over lunch in the ranch office, just asking questions. Victor leaned back in his chair, smiled that polished smile, and dismissed everything as clerical error. Blamed a third-party accounting firm. Said he would look into it. He did not look into it. That was when Dean made a decision that would, in ways he never imagined, save his daughter's life. He called Earl Jennings. Earl was 62 tall but slightly stooped from decades behind a repair counter. His hair was white and thin, combed neatly to one side. He wore wire-frame glasses and flannel shirts, year-round sleeves always rolled to mid-forearm. His manner was mild and patient, the kind of man who listened twice as much as he spoke. Before retiring to Red Hollow, Earl had spent 20 years as a communications technician for the United States Air Force. Technology did not intimidate him. He understood surveillance the way Dean understood cattle, quietly, thoroughly, without drama. Dean drove to Earl's shop on a Tuesday afternoon. He did not call ahead. He simply walked in, sat down at the counter, and said, "I need something that watches without being seen." Earl studied him for a moment. How small? Small enough to hide in a smoke detector. Earl did not ask why. He had known Dean Hollister for 15 years. If Dean was asking for a hidden camera, he had a reason. And if he was not offering that reason, it meant the situation was delicate enough to warrant silence. The device Earl selected was no larger than a matchbox. It recorded to a micro SD card stored inside the unit, capturing video at modest resolution, but sufficient clarity to identify faces and hear voices. Earl showed Dean how to install it inside a smoke detector casing mounted near the ceiling of his office, angled toward the desk in the seating area where meetings were held. "Check the storage card every 2 weeks," Earl told him. "It holds about 40 hours of footage before it overwrites." Dean nodded. Then he said something that Earl would remember for a long time afterward. "If anything ever happens to me, Earl, the office will know." Earl thought it was a joke, half a joke maybe, the kind of thing men say when they are worried but do not want to admit it. 6 weeks later, Dean Hollister was dead. The explosion happened at 9:47 on a Wednesday night. The generator shed sat behind the main barn, a low metal structure housing the ranch's backup power system. Dean had reportedly been performing a routine inspection. The official report filed by the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office called it mechanical failure, fuel line rupture, accidental ignition. The blast was powerful enough to collapse the shed roof and shatter windows in the barn 40 feet away. Dean died instantly. The investigation lasted 4 days. 4 days to close the book on a man who had spent 22 years building something with his bare hands. Lena would later learn that the deputy who signed off on the accident report had done so without requesting forensic analysis of the fuel system. She would learn why soon enough. Victor Langley handled everything after the explosion, the funeral arrangements, the insurance paperwork, the asset consolidation. He moved with a speed that unsettled Lena even through the fog of grief. Within 2 weeks, Victor had filed paperwork to transfer Dean's share of the ranch into his sole ownership, citing partnership agreements and survivorship clauses that Lena had never seen. She did not cry at the funeral. She stood at the edge of the cemetery in a black coat that had belonged to her father, oversized on her frame, and watched dirt fall onto the coffin. The wind was cold. The sky was the color of ash. People she barely recognized told her they were sorry. Victor stood at a respectful distance, hands clasped in front of him, wearing a dark suit that fit perfectly. He said nothing to her that day. He did not need to. His silence was its own kind of message. It was 3 days after the burial that Lena went to Victor's office in town. She sat across from his desk and told him calmly and directly that she did not believe her father's death was an accident. Victor's expression did not change. He looked at her the way a man looks at a child who has said something embarrassing at a dinner party. Patient, slightly amused, utterly dismissive. Grief makes people imagine things, Lena. She held his gaze. My father maintained that generator every week. He knew every valve, every connection. He would never have ignored a fuel leak. Victor leaned forward slightly. His voice dropped not to a whisper, but to that register men use when they want to sound reasonable while delivering a threat. I understand you're hurting, but accusations like that can cause real damage to reputations, to legal proceedings. I would hate to see you make your situation worse. Lena left his office without another word. She walked to her car, sat behind the wheel, and gripped it until her knuckles turned white. She was not imagining things. She knew her father. She knew that generator. And she knew with a certainty that sat in her chest like a stone that Victor Langley had killed him. 2 nights later, she noticed a truck parked at the end of her street that she did not recognize. Dark-colored, no plates visible, engine running. When she turned off her lights and watched from the bedroom window, the truck remained for over an hour before slowly pulling away. The next night, it was there again, this time closer. On the third night, Lena packed a canvas bag with everything she could carry. She left her apartment through the back door, crossed 2 blocks on foot, and drove her car to the one place she believed no one would think to look for her, the ranch house itself. The property was in legal limbo ownership. Disputed operations, halted, taxes unpaid. Victor had locked the main gates and changed the locks on the office and the barn. But the ranch house, the old white farmhouse where Lena had grown up, where her father had hummed country songs in the kitchen, where the porch boards were gray from 20 years of Montana wind, that house still had a window with a warped frame on the east side that Lena had climbed through as a teenager when she forgot her key. She climbed through it again, this time not as a teenager sneaking home past curfew, as a woman hiding for her life. For 6 days she lived in darkness. No electricity, no phone, no contact with anyone. She ate sparingly. She slept in short bursts, waking at every sound. She kept the fireplace poker within arm's reach at all times. And she thought about the camera. Her father had mentioned it once, half smiling over a beer on the porch, in that way he had of saying important things as if they were jokes. If anything ever goes sideways, the office will know. She had not understood at the time. Now she did. If that camera was still in the smoke detector, if the SD card was still inside, then whatever happened in that office on the night her father died might still be recorded. But the office was locked. Victor had changed every lock on the property, and she had seen fresh tire tracks near the gravel drive, which meant someone was watching the place. She could not get to it alone. Then on the 7th night, someone walked through her front door. The man who lowered his pen light was not what Lena expected. He was tall, lean rather than bulky, the kind of build that suggested endurance rather than display. His dark hair was cut short, military precise. A faint scar ran from the corner of his jaw toward his ear, partially hidden beneath a trimmed but rugged beard. His eyes, gray-blue even in the dim light, had a quality she recognized immediately. They were assessing, not just looking at her, but mapping the room, calculating distances, noting exits. He did not rush toward her. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he did something that surprised her. He slowly removed his gloves and set them on the table. He pulled a wooden chair back from the table, positioned it deliberately, and sat down. The movement was unhurried, intentional. It said, without words, "I am not a threat." The Donga German Shepherd, with a thick sable coat and amber eyes that caught the faint light from the windows, did something equally surprising. Instead of advancing, the animal lowered himself to the floor beside the man's chair. Then slowly he rolled onto his side and exposed his belly. It was a gesture of non-threat, deliberate, and trained, the kind of behavior that comes from years of working with frightened people. "My name is Cole Brannigan," the man said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not waste words. "This is Coda. He will not hurt you." Lena's grip on the fireplace poker did not loosen. "Who sent you?" "Nobody. I bought this place today. $10. County sale." Silence. "You bought my father's ranch," she said. Cole studied her for a moment. "Your father's?" "My name is Lena Hollister. This ranch belonged to my family until a month ago." She watched him carefully. His posture did not change. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. She could see him processing, filing the information away, connecting it to whatever he already knew about the property's troubled history. Coda shifted on the floor, lifting his head slightly to watch her. His ears were forward, alert, but not tense. There was intelligence in those amber eyes, a watchfulness that felt almost human. "You are not with Victor?" Lena asked. Cole shook his head once. "Then why are you here?" He exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh, something closer to acknowledgement. 13 years in the Navy SEALs, 18 months out, needed land, needed quiet. This place was cheap. It was cheap because someone died here. "I know." Another silence. The wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere outside, a branch scraped against the roof. Lena made a decision in that moment, not because she trusted him. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford, but because she had spent 6 days alone in the dark and the fear was beginning to calcify into something worse than fear. Paralysis. And paralysis would get her killed. She lowered the poker, not all the way, just enough to signal that she was willing to talk. "My father did not die in an accident," she said. "His partner Victor Langley killed him. And I can prove I can get to the evidence." She told him everything. She spoke for nearly an hour without interruption. She told him about the financial discrepancies, the missing revenue, the invoices that did not match. She told him about Dean confronting Victor, about Victor's dismissal, about the tension that had been building for weeks before the explosion. She told him about the camera. Cole listened the way a man trained in intelligence gathering listens, without fidgeting, without interrupting, without offering premature judgment. His eyes never left her face. Coda had moved closer to Lena during the telling, positioning himself a few feet from her, sitting calmly watching. At some point, Lena extended a cautious hand. Coda sniffed it, then nudged gently against her fingers. The warmth of the dog's fur against her skin was the first physical comfort she had felt in days. She exhaled, and something in her shoulders loosened by a fraction. When she finished, Cole was quiet for a long time. The fire he had started in the stone fireplace crackled between them. Shadows moved across the worn floorboards. "The camera," he said finally. "Is it still in the office?" "I believe so. The smoke detector casing was still on the ceiling when I checked through the window 2 weeks ago. But Victor changed the locks, and there are guards." Cole nodded slowly. He looked toward the window, toward the darkness where the ranch office sat half a mile across open pasture. "If that footage shows what you described," he said, "that is motive. That is preparation. That is threat." "It is not proof of murder," Lena said quietly. "No," Cole agreed, "but it is the beginning of it." He turned back to her. His expression was direct, without pity, without condescension. "This is your fight, Lena. Your father, your land, your decision. I can help you get to that office. I can watch your back. But the choice to go in, to push this forward, that has to be yours." Lena looked at the dog sitting beside her, at the fire casting warmth into a room that had been cold for 6 days, at this stranger who had walked into her father's house and sat down like a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be still. She thought about her father, about his rough hands and his country songs and his quiet, stubborn belief that the land belonged to those who bled for it. She thought about Victor Langley sitting behind his polished desk, calculating how to erase a man's life and call it an accident. And she thought about the camera, that small, patient eye mounted near the ceiling, watching, recording, holding the truth in a space no larger than a thumbnail. "I am going in," she said. Cole met her gaze. Coda's tail swept once across the dusty floor. Outside, the Montana wind drove hard across the empty pasture. The mountains were invisible behind the clouds. The temperature continued to drop. Somewhere in the dark on the other side of that pasture, a smoke detector casing hung from the ceiling of an unlit office, and inside it a micro SD card held 40 minutes of footage that no one had seen. 40 minutes that contained a dead man's last argument, a threat spoken clearly enough to be heard, and the shadow of a man standing alone with a blueprint of the machine that would kill his partner less than an hour later. The truth was waiting, and for the first time in 6 days, Lena Hollister was no longer hiding from it. She was going to find it. Cole Brannigan spent the next day doing what 13 years of special operations had trained him to do. He watched. He walked the perimeter of the ranch property at a distance, moving along the tree line with Coda at his side. He did not approach the office building. He did not cross any open ground. He simply observed the way a man reads a map before entering terrain he does not control. The ranch office was a low rectangular structure, positioned near the old livestock pens, roughly half a mile from the main house across open pasture. The generator shed, or what remained of it, sat behind the office like a wound in the earth. Twisted metal, scorched concrete. The blast radius was wider than Cole had expected. Whatever had ignited that fuel system had not been subtle. He noted the details methodically. Tire tracks on the gravel drive fresh from a vehicle that came and went at irregular intervals. Cigarette butts near the fence line filtered same brands, smoked down to the same length. Someone had been standing there regularly, watching and waiting. A single porch light on the office building burned out or disconnected. Windows, dark curtains drawn. No visible security cameras, but that did not mean none existed. By afternoon, he had mapped 2 approach routes. The western approach followed the tree line downwind, keeping their scent away from the property. The eastern approach used a shallow creek bed that ran within 200 yards of the office, offering concealment but slower movement through water. He chose the western route as primary. The creek bed would serve as an escape corridor. He returned to the ranch house at dusk. Lena was sitting at the kitchen table studying a hand-drawn layout of the office interior. She had sketched it from memory, every door, every window, every piece of furniture. The desk where her father sat, the wall cabinet where maintenance schematics were kept, the smoke detector mounted near the ceiling above the filing cabinets. 2 guards, Cole told her, setting a pair of field binoculars on the table. One is big, 6'2" at least, full beard trucker cap, heavy build. Moves slow patrols the perimeter every 40 minutes or so. The other is younger, thin, blonde hair cut short on the sides. He stays near the driveway and carries a radio. Lena studied the layout. The big one is probably Hank Duvall. He used to do odd jobs around town. The younger one could be Troy Phelps. He played football in high school and never left Red Hollow. Cole sat across from her. Coda positioned himself near the doorway, watching both the entrance and the hallway. A habit from years of deployment, not comfort. The window on the east side of the office, Cole said. Warped frame, old wood. It was not fully sealed when I checked. Lena nodded. That window has never latched properly. My father kept meaning to fix it. Something shifted in her expression when she mentioned her father. A softening around the eyes followed immediately by a hardening of the jaw. Grief and anger inseparable, feeding each other. I know the layout inside, she said. I know which smoke detector. I can be in and out in 3 minutes. Cole looked at her steadily. You want to go in yourself? It is my father's office, my father's camera, my evidence. She met his gaze without flinching. You said this was my fight. He considered this. In the teams, he had learned to trust people who knew their terrain. Lena knew that office the way he knew a mission objective. Every corner, every shadow, every escape route. She was not asking permission. She was stating intent. I will be outside, he said. If anything goes wrong, you get to the window and you do not stop moving until you reach the tree line. And Coda. Cole looked at the dog. Coda's ears twitched at the sound of his name. Coda has his own job. They waited for full dark. The sky over Carter Ranch turned iron gray as evening settled. A storm was building somewhere beyond the mountain ridge, though no thunder sounded yet. The air felt heavy, colder than the forecast had predicted. Wind pressed low across the grasslands, bending the brittle stalks in waves that looked almost like movement. At 10:15, they left the ranch house. Cole wore dark jeans, a charcoal thermal shirt, and a worn field jacket from his service years. No insignia remained on it. His boots were designed for silence. Lena wore dark clothing and her father's canvas work jacket, the one with the torn cuff that he had worn every day of his working life. The jacket was too large on her. She did not care. It smelled like him, like diesel and hay, and something warm that she could not name. Coda moved beside Cole, posture alert but controlled. His sable coat blended with the shadows. His breathing was barely audible. They followed the tree line west, staying low. The wind moved in their favor, carrying their scent away from the office. The distance was half a mile, but in darkness over uneven ground, with the need for absolute silence, it took nearly 20 minutes. Halfway across the final stretch of open pasture, Coda froze. Cole stopped instantly. His hand went to Coda's collar, a light touch that communicated hold. The dog's head lowered. A soft huff through his nose. Movement ahead. A figure emerged from the shadow near the equipment shed. Large, heavy-shouldered. A flashlight beam swept lazily across the ground. Hank Duvall right on schedule, making his perimeter round. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man performing a routine rather than expecting trouble. The flashlight played along fence posts and ground edges, more habit than vigilance. Cole waited. Lena pressed flat against the cold ground beside him. She could feel the frost beginning to form on the grass beneath her palms. Her breath came in shallow, controlled pulses. She had never done anything like this in her life, but she was not afraid. Fear had exhausted itself over the past 6 days. What remained was something harder. Purpose. Hank turned his back and moved toward the far gate. Cole tapped Lena's shoulder once. They crossed the final stretch of open ground in a low, fast crouch and reached the back wall of the office undetected. The east window was exactly as Cole had described. Warped frame, old wood, swollen from years of weather. Cole tested it gently. It shifted, unlocked. He slid it open slowly, inch by inch, until the gap was wide enough for a person to climb through. He looked at Lena. She nodded once. She went through the window headfirst, catching herself on the inside sill and lowering her body to the floor without sound. The office smelled stale, dust and old paper, and the faint chemical residue of cleaning products that had not been used in weeks. The darkness inside was nearly complete. She oriented herself by memory. Desk to the left, filing cabinet straight ahead, wall cabinet to the right. She looked up. The smoke detector was still there, yellowed plastic slightly crooked on its mount. Exactly where it had always been. Lena positioned a chair beneath it with excruciating care, shifting it across the floor 1 inch at a time to avoid scraping. She climbed up. Her fingers found the casing. She twisted it carefully the way Earl Jennings had shown her, father counterclockwise, then a slight pull downward. The unit detached. She opened the casing with her fingernails. The micro SD card was still inside. Small, black, no larger than a thumbnail, holding perhaps the last recorded moments of her father's life. She slipped it into the breast pocket of Dean's canvas jacket and sealed the pocket closed. She replaced the empty casing on the ceiling mount. No sign of tampering. Then from outside, Coda's posture changed. Cole saw it before he heard anything. Ears straight up, body rigid, a low, controlled growl, deliberate and warning. Footsteps, coming from the south side of the building. Cole pressed against the wall. Through the darkness, he saw the beam of a flashlight sweeping toward the office. Hank's voice, closer than expected, muttered to himself. "Thought I heard something." Cole gave 2 quick taps on the window frame, the signal to move. Lena was already at the window. She slid through it with a speed born of adrenaline, dropping to the ground outside just as Hank's flashlight swung toward the east wall. "There!" Hank shouted. A second voice erupted from near the driveway. Troy Phelps, younger, faster, appeared from behind the shed carrying a radio in one hand and a flashlight in the other. His blonde hair caught the light briefly before he broke into a run. "Heading west," Troy yelled into the radio. Cole grabbed Lena's arm and they ran, low fast toward the tree line. Coda did not follow them. Instead, the dog did something extraordinary. He veered sharply to the right, crashing deliberately through underbrush, with enough noise to sound like two people running. The sound split. Hank, heavier and slower, followed the louder noise. Troy hesitated at the fork, uncertain which direction to choose, then committed to following Hank. Coda circled wide in a practiced arc, a maneuver he had performed in training 100 times. He crashed through brush for 30 seconds, then went silent. Absolutely silent. He doubled back on a different path, moving like smoke through the trees, and rejoined Cole and Lena without a sound. Cole led them to the shallow creek bed he had mapped earlier that day. The water was cold enough to make Lena gasp as it reached her ankles. They moved downstream, using the current to mask their tracks and break any scent trail. Coda followed without hesitation, his thick coat shedding water as he moved. Behind them, shouting grew distant. Flashlights flickered between tree trunks, but the rising wind scattered the sounds and made direction impossible to judge. Within minutes, the forest was alive with its own noise. Branches cracking, leaves scattering. The storm that had been building all evening was arriving, and it brought chaos with it. By the time they reached the outer boundary of the ranch property, no voices followed. Cole crouched beside a fallen log, listening. Nothing but wind and the first heavy drops of rain beginning to fall. Lena leaned against a tree, breathing hard. Her hands were shaking. Not from cold, from the reality of what she had just done. Coda pressed lightly against her leg. She looked down at them, on his amber eyes steady in the darkness, his wet fur warm against her jeans. She placed a hand on his neck. "Thank you," she whispered. They returned to the ranch house as the storm broke fully overhead. Thunder rolled across the Montana plains. Rain hammered the tin roof and sheets. Inside, Lena pulled the SD card from her father's jacket pocket and held it up in the firelight. It was so small, so ordinary, and yet everything depended on what it contained. Cole set up his laptop on the kitchen table. He inserted the card into a compact reader. The screen flickered. A series of video files appeared, time-stamped, dated. Lena sat down. Her hands were steady now. Cole clicked the most recent file. The footage was grainy but clear enough. The office interior materialized on screen. The desk, the wall cabinet, the corkboard with faded ranch maps. Then Dean Hollister appeared. The sound that came from Lena was not a gasp. It was something quieter and deeper. The involuntary catch of breath that happens when you see someone you love who is already gone. Dean moved across the frame with his familiar, broad-shouldered walk, wearing the same canvas jacket Lena wore now. His silver hair caught the overhead light. He sat behind the desk, rubbed his face with both hands, and waited. Robert entered moments later. Even on the low-resolution camera, Victor Langley carried himself with unmistakable confidence. Dark hair neatly combed, jaw clean-shaven, posture straight, the controlled expression of a man accustomed to winning. The conversation began calmly. Dean spoke first, his voice measured but firm, referencing specific account numbers, specific transaction dates, specific dollar amounts that did not reconcile. Victor stood across the desk, arms folded, offering explanations that sounded rehearsed even through the compressed audio. Then the tone shifted. Dean pushed a folder across the desk. "This account, Victor, the one in Bozeman, I traced 3 deposits from our livestock sales directly into it. Your name is on it, not the ranch's." Victor's composure cracked, not visibly, not to a casual observer, but the camera caught it, a tightening around the eyes, a shift in weight from one foot to the other, the body language of a man calculating whether to continue lying or escalate. He escalated. Victor leaned forward, both hands on the desk, and spoke in a voice that was quiet and absolutely clear. "If you go to the bank with this, you will regret it." Dean stood. He pointed toward the door. "Get off my property." Victor did not leave immediately. The camera recorded what happened next with the patience of a machine that does not judge and does not forget. Dean exited the frame, his footsteps receding. Victor remained alone in the office. He stood still for nearly a minute, staring at the door through which Dean had left. Then he moved. He opened the desk drawer. He removed a folder. He walked to the wall cabinet and took out a laminated blueprint, the maintenance schematic of the generator shed. He studied it for several minutes. Then he removed something small from the cabinet, too small for the camera resolution to identify, and placed it carefully into the inner pocket of his coat. He stood there alone in the office of the man he had just threatened, holding the blueprint of the machine that would kill him in less than an hour. The footage ended. The storage card had been full. The timestamp read 8:41. The generator shed exploded at 9:47. 66 minutes between the end of the recording and the end of Dean Hollister's life. Lena sat in silence. The rain hammered the roof. The fire crackled. Coda lay beneath the table with his chin on Cole's boot. "Play it again," Lena said quietly. Cole looked at her. "The part where my father is talking. Just the beginning." He rewound. Dean's voice filled the kitchen. Calm, steady, a little tired. Talking about numbers and accounts and discrepancies. The way he talked about everything methodically, honestly, without drama. Lena closed her eyes and listened. Not to the words, to the voice itself, to the cadence of a man she would never hear again, except through the tiny speaker of a laptop in a house that still smelled like him. She did not cry in the way people expect grief to look. There was no sobbing, no collapse. She simply sat with her eyes closed and let the sound of her father's voice wash through her like water through a broken dam. When the clip ended, she opened her eyes and they were wet, but her jaw was set. "Now we take this to someone who can do something with it," she said. Sheriff Ray Colton arrived the following afternoon. He drove up the gravel road in a county vehicle parked precisely and removed his gray Stetson hat before stepping inside. He was 52 tall and lean, with a face carved by decades of Montana sun. His mustache was thick and silver-trimmed, with the kind of precision that suggested a man who controlled what he could control because the world gave him so little control over everything else. He had been sheriff of Gallatin County for 12 years, widowed for 5. He carried his authority the way he carried his grief, quietly with steady hands. He watched the footage without interruption. When it ended, he exhaled slowly. "That is motive," he said. He looked at Lena. "You are willing to give a formal statement?" "Yes. This will not be simple." "I know." Within 48 hours, the sheriff's office secured a warrant for forensic re-examination of the generator shed site. Detective Claire Sutton joined the investigation. She was in her late 30s, medium height, with a compact, athletic build. Her brown hair was pulled into a low bun. She had pale gray eyes and a measured way of speaking that conveyed both competence and restraint. A thin scar crossed her left eyebrow, a reminder of a traffic stop that had gone sideways 3 years earlier. She had spent 6 years in forensic analysis before transferring to field investigation. Standing in the debris field of the destroyed shed, Claire crouched beside a bent metal valve. She ran a gloved finger along the fractured line. "This was not a random rupture," she said. She pointed to tool marks on the pressure valve. "Manual adjustment, pressure override. Someone loosened this deliberately." Colton frowned. "You are saying it was tampered with." "I am saying this system did not fail on its own. Lab results came back within a week. Residue patterns inconsistent with accidental mechanical failure. The pressure valve had been partially loosened prior to ignition. The ignition source was deliberate. Simultaneously, financial investigators began reviewing ranch accounts. The discrepancies Dean had documented in his leather notebook were confirmed and then some. Funds diverted to shell accounts. Unauthorized transfers bearing Victor Langley's signature. A systematic pattern of financial fraud spanning at least 3 years. Victor Langley was arrested on a Tuesday evening just after sunset. Deputies found him standing on the porch of his house in town wearing a pressed navy sweater and dark jeans, hands in his pockets, as though he had been expecting them. His face remained composed. "What is this about?" he asked evenly. Sheriff Colton stepped forward. "Victor Langley, you are under arrest for the murder of Dean Hollister, destruction of property, and financial fraud." For a moment, something moved behind Victor's eyes. Not fear, anger. The quick, cold fury of a man who believed he had covered every angle and was now realizing he had missed one. "You do not have proof," he said. Colton met his gaze. "We have enough." Handcuffs clicked into place. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. Victor did not resist. He walked to the patrol vehicle with the measured stride of a man who was already calculating his next move. Lena stood on the porch of the ranch house and watched the patrol cars disappear down the gravel road. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing. Stars appeared over the mountains for the first time in days. Coda sat beside her, pressed gently against her leg. Cole stood near the doorway. "It is over," Lena said. It was almost a question. Cole did not answer immediately. He had seen enough operations to know that the moment you believe something is over is usually the moment it gets complicated. "For now," he said. But now was not over. Not even close. And what came next would make the arrest look like the easy part. 2 weeks after Victor Langley was taken into custody, his attorney arrived in Red Hollow. The man's name was Garrison Webb, and he had driven from a firm in Helena with a reputation for defending clients who could afford to win. Webb was in his late 50s, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and possessed the particular calm of someone who had dismantled cases for a living. Webb filed 3 motions within his first 72 hours in town. The first challenged the admissibility of the SD card footage. The camera had been installed without Victor's knowledge or consent. The card had been retrieved through unauthorized entry into a locked building. Trespassing. Illegal search. Every frame of that footage, Webb argued, was fruited of a poison tree. The second motion challenged the ownership transfer of the ranch. Webb produced a document bearing Dean Hollister's signature dated 2 weeks before the explosion, which appeared to transfer Dean's ownership share to Victor Langley voluntarily. The document looked legitimate. The signature was convincing. Lena had never seen it before. The third motion requested Victor's release on bail, citing his deep roots in the community, lack of prior criminal record, and the speculative nature of the charges. The judge granted bail. Victor Langley walked out of the county jail on a Thursday morning, adjusted his collar, and drove home. Lena received the news while standing in the kitchen of the ranch house. She set the phone down on the table and stared at it for a long time. Cole watched her from across the room. He did not speak. He recognized the expression on her face. He had seen it in the mirror more times than he could count. The expression of someone who has done everything right and been told it was not enough. "The footage might be thrown out," she said finally. Her voice was flat, not defeated, compressed, like a spring being pushed down. "The only evidence we have, and his lawyer is going to make it disappear." "The forensic evidence," Cole said carefully, "supports the conclusion but does not prove who did it. Without the footage showing Victor with the blueprint holding something from the cabinet making a direct threat, the physical evidence is circumstantial." She sat down. Coda walked to her side and pressed his head against her knee. She rested her hand on his broad skull fingers curling into the thick fur behind his ears. "And now he says my father signed the ranch over to him." Her jaw tightened. "My father would never have done that. That signature is forged, but proving a forgery takes time and money I do not have." The false victory had collapsed. The arrest, the evidence, the momentary belief that justice was within reach, all of it was crumbling. And in its place stood something worse than the original injustice. The prospect that Victor might not only go free but take the ranch as well. Winter arrived as if it had been waiting for the worst possible moment. The first blizzard hit 3 days before Thanksgiving. It began as light snowfall in the afternoon, picturesque, almost gentle. By nightfall, the wind turned violent. Snow moved sideways, erasing fence lines and burying the gravel drive within hours. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero. The barn roof groaned under accumulating weight. Lena stood near the window watching the world disappear. "We do not have enough feed stored," she said. "My father always kept an extra month of supply." Victor's financial games left the orders incomplete. Cole pulled on his coat without a word. Coda was already standing ears forward ready. Outside visibility collapsed to less than 10 feet. Cole moved through the storm with the deliberate precision of a man who had trained in Arctic conditions, a shovel strapped across his back. A rope tied around his waist, the other end anchored to the porch railing, a technique from cold weather survival school that prevented disorientation in whiteout conditions. Coda stayed at his flank, head low against the wind, his thick double coat catching snow along his back. At 5 years old, the dog was in his physical prime. His paws cut through drifts without hesitation. His breathing remained steady, even as the wind screamed around them. They reached the barn and forced the doors open against the accumulated snow. The cattle inside shifted nervously, eyes wide, hooves stamping. Cole worked steadily, reinforcing support beams with lumber he found stacked against the wall, redistributing hay to keep the animals calm and fed. When one of the smaller calves panicked and bolted toward the open door, Coda responded instantly. He positioned his body between the calf and the exit, not aggressively, not barking, but simply standing there, immovable and calm. The calf slowed. Coda guided it gently back toward the herd with subtle movements of his body. Controlled herding, instinct sharpened by years of training. By dawn, the storm eased. The ranch still stood. The cattle were alive. The financial reckoning came next. Janet Caldwell, the regional bank officer, met with Lena in her office in town. Janet was in her late 40s, tall and composed, with straight blonde hair cut precisely at shoulder length and pale blue eyes that carried the firm steadiness of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. She had lost her own family farm 20 years earlier when her father defaulted on loans after consecutive drought seasons. Since then, she believed in structure, not sympathy. "You are inheriting more than land," Janet said calmly. "There is outstanding debt from operational losses. Taxes were delayed during the legal freeze." She slid a paper across the polished oak desk. The number was heavy. "We can restructure," Janet continued, her tone practical, "but income must resume within 90 days. 90 days, in the middle of a Montana winter, with a herd reduced by neglect, equipment in disrepair, and a legal battle consuming every dollar Lena did not have." Lena walked out of the bank and stood on the sidewalk in the cold. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply stood there, her father's canvas jacket pulled tight around her, and felt the weight of it all pressing down like the snow on the barn roof. Cole found her there 20 minutes later. He did not ask what happened. He could read it on her face. "90 days, she said. He nodded. "I do not know how to do this." "Yes, you do." She looked at him. His gray blue eyes were steady, not optimistic, not reassuring, just present. The eyes of a man who understood that sometimes survival is not about knowing the answer. It is about refusing to stop moving until the answer reveals itself. That night, something happened that neither of them discussed afterward, but which changed the texture of their relationship in ways that mattered. Cole woke at 2 in the morning. His breathing was ragged. The ceiling above him blurred into memory. Wooden beams became sand-colored walls. The wind outside became something else entirely, the concussive percussion of ordnance, the sharp crack of rifle fire, the sound of a voice calling a name he could not save. He sat upright in bed, pulse racing, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the freezing temperature. His hands trembled. His vision narrowed. Before the panic could fully take hold, Coda was there. The dog had been sleeping on the floor beside the bed. Now he climbed halfway onto the mattress, pressing his full weight against Cole's chest. 70 pounds of warm, solid breathing reality. Cole buried his hands in Coda's thick fur and held on. The dog did not move. He did not whine. He simply pressed closer, anchoring Cole to the present moment with the patient certainty of an animal who had done this before many times across many nights. "Just wind," Cole whispered hoarsely. "It is just wind." Coda remained until Cole's breathing steadied, until his hands stopped shaking, until the room became a room again and not a memory. Across the hallway, Lena heard the movement. She heard the sharp intake of breath, the muffled sound of a man fighting something invisible. She lay still in the dark and listened until the sound subsided. She did not knock on his door. She did not intrude. In the morning, she placed a mug of coffee on the kitchen table beside him, without comment. Their eyes met briefly. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. Two people who understood damage recognized each other without words. In December, the legal situation worsened. At a preliminary hearing, Victor Langley's attorney presented his challenge to the footage evidence with surgical precision. The judge agreed to consider the admissibility question and scheduled a full hearing for February. If the footage was ruled inadmissible, the prosecution's case would collapse to circumstantial evidence alone. But something happened at that hearing that Lena did not expect. She was seated in the gallery when Victor took his place at the defense table. He wore a dark suit, his hair was neatly combed, his expression was composed, controlled, the mask of a man who had spent his entire adult life managing how others perceived him. The hearing proceeded through legal arguments and procedural motions. Then the prosecution played a short excerpt of the footage for context, Dean's voice filling the courtroom. The familiar cadence, the tired but steady tone of a man stating facts he wished were not true. And something happened to Victor's face. It was brief, no more than 2 or 3 seconds. A fracture in the composure. Not guilt exactly, not remorse. Something closer to the involuntary flinch of a man who has been running from a sound and suddenly hears it again. His jaw tightened, his eyes dropped, and Lena, watching from 15 feet away, saw his lips move. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. She could not hear the words, but she would learn them later from a court reporter who had been close enough to catch the fragment. I did not think it would go this far. It was not a confession. It was not even an admission. But it was the first crack Lena had seen in Victor Langley's armor. And in that moment, she understood something about the man who had killed her father. He was not a monster. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was a coward. A man who had let greed push him one step further than he ever intended to go. And then another step, and then another, until he was standing alone in an office with a blueprint and a plan and no way back. That understanding did not make her hate him less, but it sharpened something inside her. Because cowards, she realized, are more dangerous than monsters. Monsters act from nature. Cowards act from desperation. And desperate men do not stop. The hearing ended without resolution. The judge would rule on admissibility in February. Lena walked out of the courthouse into cold gray daylight. Cole was waiting beside the truck with Coda. "Well?" he asked. Lena climbed into the passenger seat and stared through the windshield at the courthouse. "He is scared," she said. "Good. Scared people make mistakes. Scared people also burn down houses." Cole looked at her. She was not being dramatic. She was being precise. And she was right. January brought the wolves. The tracks appeared, first large, deliberate impressions in the snow near the outer pasture fence. Coda noticed before anyone else. During the afternoon check of the livestock, his posture changed. Head high, nose testing the air repeatedly. Every muscle in his body communicating the same message. Something is out there. At dusk, distant howls rolled across the plains. Long rising notes that carried for miles in the frozen air. Lena's face went pale. Cole loaded a rifle. Not to hunt, to deter. They positioned lanterns near the perimeter fence, the light serving as a psychological barrier. Near midnight, Coda's low growl signaled movement. Two gray shapes materialized from the drifting snow, moving with the fluid precision of apex predators. Coda did not charge blindly. He moved along the fence line, barking once sharp and commanding. The wolves hesitated. Cole fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked across the frozen landscape. The predators retreated, disappearing back into the white darkness. But Lena did not go inside. She stood at the fence through the rest of the night, watching a lantern in one hand and a determination in her posture that had not been there when Cole first found her hiding in the dark. This was not the same woman who had pressed herself against a wall with a fireplace poker. This was someone who had decided that nothing else would be taken from her. Not the cattle, not the land, not the justice she was owed. Coda returned from his patrol snow, clinging to his muzzle, and sat beside her. She knelt and wrapped her arms briefly around his thick neck. "Good boy," she whispered. The wind carried her voice away, but Coda's tail swept once across the snow. He understood. February arrived with a cold that settled into the bones of the ranch like something permanent, and with it came a danger that no one anticipated. Lena had begun using the old storm cellar beneath the ranch house to store emergency supplies. Canned goods, bottled water, extra blankets, lantern fuel. The cellar was accessed through a heavy wooden door in the hallway floor, opening onto steep concrete steps that descended into darkness. One evening, as Lena lifted the cellar door and began to descend with a lantern, Coda did something unusual. He followed her to the top of the stairs and stopped. He did not continue down. Instead, he began pawing at the door frame with increasing urgency. Then he whined. A sharp, insistent sound that was completely out of character for an animal trained to operate in silence. Cole heard the whining from the kitchen. He was beside Coda in seconds. The dog's body was rigid, his nose working rapidly, his ears flat against his skull. Every signal in his trained repertoire was firing at once. Cole knelt at the cellar entrance and inhaled. The smell was faint, sweet and chemical. Propane. "Lena, stop. Do not move." She froze on the third step, lantern held at waist height. An open flame 6 feet from a propane leak. "Set the lantern down very slowly," Cole said. His voice was calm, absolutely controlled, the voice of a man who had diffused situations where panic meant death. Then come back up. Lena placed a lantern on the step beside her with a steady hand. She climbed back up. Cole pulled her clear of the opening and immediately dropped down the stairs himself, breathing through the collar of his shirt. The source was a small propane line feeding the backup heater in the cellar. The leak was not large, but in an enclosed space the gas had accumulated to a concentration that could have ignited instantly from the lantern flame. Cole shut off the valve and opened the cellar's small ventilation window. Cold air rushed in, displacing the gas. He stayed below until the smell cleared, then climbed back up. Koda remained tense at the cellar door until Cole emerged. Only then did the dog relax, lowering himself to the floor and resting his head between his paws, his watch complete. It was not dramatic. There was no explosion, no near miss in the Hollywood sense. But had Lena descended 3 more steps with that open flame, the result would have been identical to what happened in the generator shed. Another Hollister killed by a gas ignition in a confined space. Cole examined the propane line more carefully the next morning. What he found turned his blood cold. The line had not corroded. It had not weakened from age or pressure. There were marks on the pipe-thin, precise scratches consistent with a cutting tool that had been applied partially, but not completely, weakening the line enough to create a slow leak rather than an immediate rupture. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone who wanted it to look like an accident. He called Claire Sutton. The detective arrived within 2 hours, processed the scene, and lifted prints from the cellar entrance and the pipe itself. The prints belonged to Troy Phelps. Troy was arrested at his apartment that evening. He broke within an hour of questioning. Nervous, frightened, and completely out of his depth, he told detectives everything. Victor Langley had contacted him from outside jail during his time on bail. The instructions were specific. Create a gas leak in the cellar, make it look like aging infrastructure. Target Lena. Victor Langley's bail was revoked immediately. He was taken back into custody, this time with an additional charge, attempted murder. And now Lena stood in the kitchen of the ranch house in the dead of a Montana February, with the walls closing in from every direction. The footage might be thrown out. The forged transfer document threatened her ownership. The ranch was drowning in debt, and the man who killed her father had just tried to kill her too. Cole leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her. Koda lay near the door. His lawyer is going to argue that Troy acted alone, Lena said, that Victor had nothing to do with it. Maybe. The footage hearing is in 2 weeks. If the judge throws it out, Victor's murder charge depends entirely on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a 20-year-old who already has every reason to make a deal. She placed both hands flat on the table and stared at the surface as though it held answers. I could accept the settlement, she said quietly. His lawyer offered 1 last month. I drop the charges, take a payment, walk away. Start over somewhere else. Cole said nothing. My father would not want me to die for this land. Cole still said nothing. He understood what she was doing. She was testing the thought out loud, holding it up to see if it held weight. It was not his place to answer for her. Lena looked at the canvas jacket hanging by the door. Dean's jacket. The torn cuff. The smell of hay and diesel that was slowly fading. She walked to it, took it off the hook, and held it against her chest. She stood like that for a long time. The fire crackled. The wind moaned outside. Koda watched her with his steady amber eyes. And somewhere in the silence, she heard her father's voice. Not from the footage, from memory. From a summer evening on the porch when she was 17 and complaining about the endless work of ranch life. This land is not ours because of paperwork, Lena. It is ours because we bled for it. She hung the jacket back on the hook. No settlement, she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was iron in it now. We find another way. The February hearing was 12 days away when Earl Jennings drove up the gravel road to Carter Ranch in a truck that was older than most of the fence posts lining the property. Lena was in the barn when she heard the engine. She stepped outside, squinting against the sharp winter light, and watched the vehicle park beside Cole's truck. The driver's door opened slowly and a tall, slightly stooped man climbed out. White hair thin and combed neatly. Wire-framed glasses, flannel shirt beneath a heavy canvas coat. Hands that moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime working with small, delicate things. Koda reached Earl before Lena did. The dog approached cautiously, nose working, then sat. He did not growl. He did not tense. Coda had been trained to detect threats, and whatever he detected in this quiet, aging man was not threatening. Earl Jennings stood in the cold and looked at Lena. His expression held something that took her a moment to identify. Shame. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet, erosive kind that comes from knowing you should have acted sooner. "You look like your father," he said. Lena studied him. She had met Earl only a few times as a child, brief visits when Dean stopped by the electronics shop in town. She remembered him vaguely. The gentle voice, the flannel shirts, the glasses that always sat slightly crooked on his nose. "Earl Jennings," she said. "Yes. My father mentioned you." Earl nodded slowly. His breath came out in thin white clouds. "I should have come sooner. I know that. And I will not insult you with excuses." Cole appeared at the barn door watching. Coda positioned himself between the two conversations, attentive to both. "Come inside," Lena said. They sat at the kitchen table. Earl held a mug of coffee in both hands, though he did not drink from it. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the worn furniture, the peeling wallpaper, the faint water stain on the ceiling. The house of his friend, the house where Dean Hollister had raised his daughter and planned his future and hummed country songs in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. "Your father came to my shop about 7 weeks before the explosion," Earl began. His voice was measured, deliberate. "He wanted a camera, small enough to hide. I helped him select the unit and showed him how to install it in the smoke detector." "I know," Lena said. "I found the card." Earl looked at her. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his canvas coat and removed a small plastic case. Inside it was a micro SD card, identical in size and type to the one Lena had retrieved from the office. 2 days before the explosion. "Earl said your father drove to my shop. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. He walked in, sat down at the counter, and handed me this. He said the main card was almost full, and he wanted a backup of the most important footage." Earl set the case on the table between them. "He told me if anything happens to me, Earl, hold on to this." I asked him what he meant. He shook his head and said it was probably nothing, just a precaution. The room was very quiet. The fire popped once. Coda's ears shifted toward the sound, then settled. "When the explosion happened," Earl continued, "I was afraid. Victor Langley had connections. He had money. He had people. And I am 62 years old with a bad back and a shop that barely pays the rent. I told myself the authorities would handle it, that someone else would speak up." He looked at the table, the shame again deeper now. "No one did," he said, "and I watched the case get closed in 4 days. I watched Victor take the ranch. I watched you disappear, and I did nothing." He raised his eyes to meet Lena's. "Then I heard you were fighting, that you had come back, that you were standing up to him with nothing but your father's jacket and a stranger who believed you." Earl pushed the plastic case toward her. "This is a copy your father made voluntarily and gave to me with his own hands. It was not obtained through trespassing or unauthorized entry. It was given freely by the owner of the camera to a trusted friend, accompanied by a verbal instruction to preserve it. Any court in this country will accept it." Lena stared at the card. Such a small thing, smaller than a postage stamp, lighter than a breath. And yet it contained the weight of everything. Her father's voice, his last argument, the threat that preceded his death, the shadow of a man holding a blueprint in an empty office. She picked it up. Her hand was steady. "Why now?" she asked. Earl looked at her with eyes that were tired and clear, and finally, after weeks of silence, honest. "Because your father did not raise a coward, and watching you fight for him reminded me that he did not befriend one either. I have been a coward long enough." Cole, who had been leaning against the counter, spoke for the first time. "Can you testify to the chain of custody when he gave it to you, what he said, how you stored it? Every word, every detail. I have written it down, dated and signed. I will swear to it under oath." Lena looked at Cole. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The hearing took place on a gray February morning in the Gallatin County Courthouse. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, lit by fluorescent fixtures that hummed faintly. Sheriff Colton sat in the back row with his hat on his knee. Detective Claire Sutton occupied a seat near the prosecution table, a folder of forensic reports in her lap. Victor Langley sat at the defense table beside Garrison Webb. His dark suit was pressed, his posture was upright, his expression was carefully, deliberately blank. But Lena, who had spent weeks studying his face on grainy footage, noticed what others might miss. A tension in his hands, a tightness around his mouth, the look of a man holding something together by force of will. The prosecution's case rested on four pillars. The forensic evidence showing deliberate tampering with the generator shed's pressure valve. The financial fraud trail documenting years of systematic embezzlement. The testimony of Troy Phelps, who had confessed to sabotaging the cellar propane line on Victor's instructions. And now the footage. When the prosecution presented Earl Jennings's copy of the SD card, Garrison Webb objected immediately. He argued that it was simply a duplicate of the original tainted evidence. The prosecution countered with Earl's affidavit detailing the chain of custody. Dean Hollister had made the copy himself. He had delivered it personally. He had issued a verbal instruction to preserve it. The copy was not the product of any illegal search or unauthorized entry. It was the deliberate act of a property owner preserving evidence of fraud against his own business. The judge reviewed the arguments for what felt like hours. Lena sat in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her green eyes fixed on the bench. Coda was not allowed in the courtroom, but she could feel his absence like a missing weight against her leg. The ruling came at 11:42 in the morning. Admissible. Lena's hands tightened in her lap. She did not smile. She did not react. She simply sat still and let the words settle into her body like the first warmth of spring after months of frozen ground. The trial itself took 3 days. The footage was played for the jury in its entirety. 40 minutes of Dean Hollister's steady voice filling the courtroom. 40 minutes of Victor Langley's escalation from denial to threat. The moment when Dean pointed toward the door and told his partner to leave. The minutes that followed when Victor stood alone in the office, opened the drawer, removed the blueprint, and placed something into his coat pocket. The forensic evidence was presented in clinical detail. The loosened pressure valve, the tool marks, the residue patterns, the timeline. 66 minutes between the end of the footage and the explosion. Troy Phelps testified under a cooperation agreement. He was visibly shaken on the stand, a young man in his mid-20s who had never imagined that a simple job guarding a property would lead him to a witness box in a murder trial. He described Victor's phone calls, the specific instructions, the propane line in the cellar, the intent. Garrison Webb cross-examined aggressively, but Troy's story held. It was too detailed, too specific, and too consistent with the physical evidence to be fabricated. On the second day of trial, the prosecution called Lena Hollister to the stand. She wore a dark blouse and her father's canvas jacket. The jacket was not evidence. It was not required. But she wore it because it was the closest she could come to bringing Dean Hollister into that room. She spoke about her father, not about the evidence or the investigation or the legal proceedings, about the man himself, about his rough hands and the way they could gentle a frightened calf, about his habit of humming old country songs while repairing fence posts, about the leather notebook where he tracked every animal and every dollar with the care of someone who understood that honest accounting was a form of respect for the land and the life it sustained. She spoke about the evening he sat on the porch with a beer and told her, half smiling, that the office would know if anything went sideways. She had not understood then. She understood now. She spoke about the night she ran, about the truck with no plates parked at the end of her street, about 6 days in a dark house with a fireplace poker as her only protection, about the moment a stranger and a dog walked through the door, and for the first time in weeks, she did not feel hunted. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She spoke the way her father would have spoken, with clarity, with restraint, and with the quiet conviction of someone telling the truth because truth was the only thing worth telling. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. On the third day, the jury deliberated for 4 hours. Victor Langley was found guilty on all counts: murder in the first degree, arson, financial fraud, attempted murder through the proxy actions of Troy Phelps. When the verdict was read, Victor sat very still. His composure, the mask he had worn for years, held for approximately 10 seconds. Then it shifted, not into rage, not into despair, into something quieter and more final. The expression of a man who has spent years constructing a version of reality in which he is the protagonist and has just been told by 12 strangers that he is the villain. He turned his head slightly toward the gallery. His eyes found Lena. They looked at each other across the courtroom for a long moment. There was no triumph in her gaze, no satisfaction, only the steady, unflinching clarity of a woman who had fought for truth and found it, and now had to carry the weight of what truth costs. Victor looked away first. Outside the courthouse, the February sky was the color of old pewter. Lena stood on the steps, Dean's jacket pulled tight around her shoulders. Sheriff Colton approached hat in hand. "Your father would have been proud," he said. Lena nodded. She could not speak. Not because she was breaking down, but because the fullness of the moment occupied every space inside her, and words would have diminished it. Cole waited by the truck. Coda sat in the bed watching her approach with those amber eyes that had seen everything and judged nothing. March arrived like a hell breath being finally released. The snow began to recede in uneven patches, revealing the dark earth beneath. Water ran in thin streams along the fence lines. The air lost its razor edge and carried instead the faint mineral scent of thawing ground. The mountains, which had been buried under white for months, began to show their darker faces. Pine forests emerged from the snow line like soldiers returning to their posts. Lena stood at the edge of the pasture one morning and watched the sunrise spread across the land. It moved slowly the way spring moves in Montana, not rushing, but inevitable. Golden light touched the barn roof first, then the fence posts, then the pasture itself, still brown and dormant, but already softening. The official transfer papers had arrived 2 days earlier. Lena Hollister, sole owner, 100 acres. The document was on the kitchen table, weighted down by a coffee mug. She had read it 3 times. Each time she ran her fingers across the printed name as though confirming that it was real. The debt remained. Janet Caldwell had restructured the payment schedule, extending the timeline after the trial outcome demonstrated stable ownership. It was still heavy. It would take years. But the 90-day deadline had passed and the ranch was producing again. A small herd carefully managed. Equipment repaired by Cole's hands and Lena's knowledge of what needed fixing and in what order. Cole had packed half his belongings into the truck. The duffel bag sat in the bed beside Coda, who watched them with the calm awareness of an animal who had moved many times and understood the ritual. Cole's plan had been straightforward from the beginning. Help her find justice, then leave. He had never intended to stay anywhere. Staying meant roots, and roots meant vulnerability. He had spent 18 months since leaving the service, moving from one quiet place to another, always arriving, never settling. The PTSD did not care where he was. It followed him like weather. But something had changed during the Montana winter. Something he could not identify precisely because it was not a single moment, but an accumulation. The night Coda pressed against his chest during a panic episode, and Lena did not intrude. The morning she placed coffee beside him without comment or pity. The evenings when they sat in the living room by the fire, not speaking, not needing to speak, sharing a silence that was not empty but full. He had slept through the night 3 times since arriving at the ranch. 3 times in 18 months. Each time he had woken, surprised, disoriented by the absence of fear. Each time Coda had been lying beside the bed, and the sound of wind outside had been just wind, not memory. He stood by the truck in the early spring light, watching Lena at the edge of the pasture. Coda had jumped down from the truck bed and was trotting ahead of her along the fence line, inspecting each post with methodical attention, pausing occasionally to sniff the ground or watch a bird lift from the grass. He looked, Cole thought, like a foreman conducting a morning inspection. Cole walked toward her. His boots left prints in the softening ground. The air smelled like mud and new grass and the faint sweetness of snowmelt. "I was going to leave after the transfer," he said. Lena nodded without turning. "I know." He stood beside her. The mountains were visible in full for the first time in months, their peaks still white, but their lower soppies showing green. The sky was enormous. It always was in Montana, but today it felt intentional, as though the world had expanded specifically to hold this moment. "I have not slept through the night in years," Cole said. "Until here." Now she turned. Her green eyes studied his face, the scar along his jaw, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he was thinking. The quiet restraint that she had come to understand was not coldness, but discipline, layered over something warm and damaged and worth protecting. "I do not need saving," she said gently. but I could use a partner. The word hung in the air between them. Not romance, not dependency, not rescue. Partnership. Two people who had each been broken in different ways, choosing to build something together. Not because they could not survive alone, but because surviving alone had stopped being enough. Cole considered the barn they had reinforced together during the blizzard, the cattle alive because of their combined effort, the debt plan that was harsh but manageable, the evenings by the fire where silence felt like conversation, the mornings where coffee appeared without explanation and was accepted without pretense. For the first time since leaving the service, he did not feel like a man passing through. He felt like a man standing on ground that wanted him there. Coda came running back from his fence line inspection tail, cutting through the air in broad, joyful arcs. He circled them once, then sat between them, looking up with his ears forward and his amber eyes bright with the particular intelligence of an animal who has found his place and knows it. Cole looked at Lena. He said. The word was simple, 2 syllables, but it carried the weight of everything behind it. 13 years of service, 18 months of silence, 6 days in a dark house, a $10 deed, a camera in a smoke detector, a Dane who never left his side, a woman who fought for truth with nothing but conviction in a dead man's jacket. Lena exhaled. Not relief exactly, release. The kind that comes when you stop fighting the current and realize it has been carrying you towards solid ground all along. She looked out across the pasture. The grass was beginning to change, the brown winter stalks giving way to the first faint suggestion of green beneath. In a few weeks, the fields would be alive again. The cattle would spread out across the rolling land. The fence posts would need repair, and the barn would need painting, and the mornings would come earlier and stay longer. There was work ahead, years of it. Debt to pay, land to restore, a reputation to rebuild in a town that had watched a murder be called an accident and said nothing. But the work did not frighten her. Work was the language she had learned from her father, the language of hands and sweat and patience, the language of people who understand that land does not care about your feelings. It cares about what you do. Show up every morning, fix what is broken, feed what is hungry, endure what cannot be changed, and change what can. Dean Hollister had taught her that, and in the end, even after everything that had been taken, that knowledge remained. It was the one inheritance no one could steal. Lena reached down and rested her hand on Coda's broad head. The dog pressed against her legs, solid and warm. The wind across Carter Ranch was different now. It no longer carried the bite of winter or the howl of storms. It moved gently across the thawing fields, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine, and the distant promise of rain. The $10 ranch had become more than disputed land. It was a place where justice had been fought for and won, not quickly, not easily, but with the stubborn persistence of people who refused to accept that the truth could be buried along with the man who told it. It was a place where a soldier found something he had stopped looking for. Not peace exactly, because peace is not the absence of damage. It is the decision to build something despite the damage. It is waking up one morning and realizing that the sound outside is just wind, and the ground beneath you is solid, and the dog beside you is breathing steadily, and you do not need to reach for a weapon. It was a place where a woman proved that grief does not have to become silence, that being afraid does not mean being defeated, that standing in a courtroom in your dead father's jacket and telling the truth with a steady voice is its own kind of courage, the quiet kind, the kind that does not make headlines but changes outcomes. And it was a place where slowly, carefully, with the cautious hope of people who have learned not to trust hope too quickly, a family began to take shape. Not the kind built from obligation or convenience, the kind built from shared winter, from coffee placed without comment, from a man who chose both of them and thereby chose for them, from the understanding that two people who know what it means to lose everything are uniquely equipped to protect what they build together. Lena stood on the porch that evening as the last light faded behind the mountains. Her hand rested on the wooden railing that her father had built 20 years ago. Coda lay at her feet, his chin between his paws, watching the pasture with patient amber eyes. Cole was in the distance working on a fence post, his silhouette dark against the violet sky. The ranch was quiet, not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of beginning. The kind that fills a space just before the first green shoots push through the soil. the kind that holds everything that has happened and everything that is about to happen and asks nothing except that you keep going. Lena kept going. She always had.